Dr. Daniel Ganser, author of NATO's Secret Armies, thanks very much indeed for coming on. So mainstream media don't report this, but it is now on the record and officially documented that decades of terror attacks against their own population are in fact organised by the CIA and the White House. We keep finding this term strategy of tension by the White House. What does it mean?
Strategy of tension actually means that you blow up a bomb and say your enemy did it.
It was thanks to the indignation for the 3,000 victims of September 11 that President Bush could launch a war that had already been prepared in the smallest detail. After 9/11, most of the high-ranking people involved in this catastrophic failure were either confirmed to their posts or promoted to higher levels. Donald Rumsfeld kept his post at the Pentagon and began enjoying the largest increase in military spending after the Vietnam War. Condoleezza Rice, who had misrepresented the information the government had on the attacks in a sworn testimony, kept her post as National Security Advisor and went on to become Secretary of State in the following Bush administration. General Eberhard, the NORAD commander who didn't think of recalling the war games as soon as he knew his country was under attack, was chosen to lead the newly created U.S. Northern Command, which the Department of Defense has termed the nation's premier military homeland defense organization. Richard B. Myers, despite the total breakdown under his leadership, was promoted to chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest military post in the country. While they sat on some of the most valuable real estate in the world, after 30 years the Twin Towers had become obsolete. But the biggest problem with the Twin Towers was the large amount of asbestos they contained. Built in a time when the use of asbestos was still allowed in civil construction, at least 400 tons of this extremely dangerous material had been used to fireproof the steel structure of the buildings and to insulate hundreds of miles of pipings for water, heating, and air conditioning. Asbestos was also present in the ceiling panels, the elevator shafts, and the vinyl tiles from office floors. By the time asbestos was banned from civil construction, the Twin Towers were nearing their completion. Initially, the asbestos was encapsulated wherever possible to prevent the particles from being inhaled. But in the 1990s, the regulations grew tighter, and every time a simple renovation was needed, the complete removal and replacement of the asbestos was also required. At the same time, because of the health risk it posed, the cost of asbestos removal and abatement had been skyrocketing. It soon became clear that the Twin Towers were quickly turning from a prestigious asset into a serious liability. Reportedly, by the year 2000, the Port Authority was looking at an asbestos abatement bill of as much as $1 billion, the same money it would have cost to build a brand new tower. Back in the 90s, the Port Authority had sued the insurance companies, trying to get them to cover the cost of the asbestos removal. But in May 2001, 4 months before the terrorist attack, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey lost their 10-year-old court battle. At that point, the Port Authority was between a rock and a hard place. The Twin Towers could no longer be maintained without incurring the cost of asbestos removal, yet they could not be demolished because of the large amounts of asbestos they contained. The only remaining option was to dismantle and remove the two poison-filled giants one piece at a time. But the cost of such an operation would have been so astronomical that no one has ever tried to put a number on it. On July 24, 2001, Larry Silverstein celebrated the acquisition of the Twin Towers with a public ceremony.
Silverstein signed the lease on the World Trade Center just 6 weeks before 9/11.
He then took out an insurance policy covering the Twin Towers for $3.2 billion in case of total destruction. This is how, on the evening of September 11, Larry Silverstein found himself in control of some 12 million square feet of new office space to be built on some of the most valuable real estate in the world. In the meantime, all the asbestos from the Twin Towers has been inhaled by the citizens of downtown Manhattan, and especially by the first responders and volunteers who worked at Ground Zero, who are now being decimated by mesothelioma and other pulmonary diseases. And since on September 11, due to the terrorist attacks, Building 7 had also been destroyed, Silverstein received another $800 million to rebuild a skyscraper that had originally cost $400 million.
At 5:20 p.m., World Trade 7 suddenly, neatly and symmetrically just folded like a pancake.
It is impossible to melt that steel by the office fires, the jet fuel, or the collapse itself. It's a physical impossibility. It cannot be replicated experimentally. It defies the laws of physics. If you set aside your politics, you set aside your beliefs and your religion, and you use the scientific method. World Trade Center 7 is basically a classic controlled demolition where a building free falls and comes straight down into virtually its own footprint. The only thing that makes any sense at all from a scientific perspective is that those towers were blown up.
Dr. Graham McQueen accessed the New York Fire Department records from that day. Thanks very much for joining us. Never broadcast by mainstream media, but more than 100 witnesses have even reported the explosives bringing down the Twin Towers.
On September 11, there were dozens and dozens of loud explosions reported by firefighters, policemen, journalists, and regular citizens, both before and during the collapse of both towers.
The whole time you're hearing boom, 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 boom. So I think I know an explosion when I hear it.
What your guys' explanation is for Willie Rodriguez's testimony that he heard, experienced, and his coworkers were actually burned by an explosion in the basement of the North Tower prior to the plane hitting, and this has been verified by at least 20 different eyewitnesses.
Secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then somebody said that they saw an airliner go into one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much, much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that.
It was an explosion. We was in the lobby and the third explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
Ladies that are with me were in the World Trade Center in the first building and escaped through the lobby where they report they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
We ran down the steps to the lobby. There was no lobby. Everything was torn up.
We came outside in the lobby. There was no lobby. The lobby was totally gone.
Did you see other people?
There was a woman there with her face blown off.
And then all of a sudden, 3 tremendous explosions, and everything.
You heard a big explosion before the building fell?
I saw it as it was happening, and it sounded as if you had 100 of those little black cat firecrackers and you lit them all off at once. That's what it sounded like. It sounded like the finale of the 4th of July.
As the first tower came down, there were a series of explosions. It was like boom, boom. You could hear the echoes of the explosions echoing off the different buildings.
The detonation started, and they went boom, boom, boom. They were a little less than a second apart.
Below the fire, I saw from the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. Just
detonated. They were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom. All the way down.
So it was like boom, 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 boom.
From far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
Tower number 1, the second tower collapsed. It was the exact same series of detonations.
And then it started to sound like firecrackers. Crack, 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 crack. And we looked up, and the second tower was coming down.
This one was recorded after both of the Twin Towers had collapsed and before Tower 7's collapse.
This recording was made between 10 and 11 o'clock. The explosion came from the direction of Building 7. In fact, a big explosion in Building 7 was reported before either tower had collapsed.
I was up in the Emergency Management Center on the 23rd floor. Another gentleman and I walked down to the 8th floor where there was an explosion.
In a later interview, Jennings has confirmed the explosion took place before either tower had collapsed.
Both buildings were still standing. I was trapped in there for several hours. I was trapped in there when both buildings came down.
While he was trapped, Jennings kept hearing more explosions.
All this time, I'm hearing all type of explosions.
In fact, explosions near Building 7 were recorded up to a few minutes before the building collapsed. To doubt the content of all these accounts does not mean to have debunked the claims of explosions. It means to willfully ignore dozens and dozens of dramatic testimonies which describe a story of September 11 quite different from the one we have been told so far. Can you explain what caused the huge explosion that literally devastated the lobby of the North Tower, according to multiple witnesses, about 1 hour after the impact of the plane and before the collapse of Tower 2? Can you explain what caused the big explosion reported by Mr. Jennings and Mr. Hess on the 8th floor of Building 7 before either tower had collapsed? Can you explain what caused the multiple explosions recorded by different camera crews, including the BBC and CNN, after the towers had collapsed and before the collapse of Building 7? Can you explain how more than 100 witnesses, most of them firefighters and policemen, could have all been mistaken in reporting explosions at the Twin Towers on September 11? At 5 o'clock, the BBC announced that the building had already collapsed, even though it was still standing in the background.
Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
As you can see behind me...
At 5 o'clock, Building 7 can clearly be seen on the right of the picture. But the BBC correspondent, who was obviously unfamiliar with the landscape, didn't recognize it. This has fueled ludicrous conspiracy theories, which accuse the mainstream media of having been informed in advance of what was going to happen on September 11. In truth, this incident only confirms that the information on the impending collapse had been circulating long enough in downtown Manhattan to have already reached the BBC even before it happened. As we have seen before, the entire top section of the building falls as a single piece, maintaining an almost perfect symmetry as it descends towards the ground.
The symmetry is the smoking gun. It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
And, as we have seen before, the almost simultaneous removal of the supporting structure can only be obtained with a controlled demolition.